Well, our countdown clock has reached 0.00. So let's find the class that we're going to attend or the seat that we're going to sit in. And we will begin our class here in the auditorium. I'm grateful that Dan asked me to spend most of 2 months in a study of 2 Old Testament books, the book of Ruth and the book of Esther. I'm glad that Dan gave me that much time because I had never given myself that much time. I always in preaching had thought probably one sermon was enough for the book of Ruth or one sermon was enough for the book of Esther. So every time I've worked in a public presentation for either Ruth or Esther, it's been a sermon, which I try to make 25 minutes more or less. So to have 45 minutes, which is already twice as much, and then to have 3 or 4 weeks for each book has been, for me, a real blessing to be able to share some things that I might not normally share. If we were to say one thing that would summarize perhaps our study during these 2 months of the books of Ruth and Esther, it is that God has been working out His plan. He worked out His plan through Ruth and several centuries later, as we will see, through Esther. And I was also thinking about people that we would perhaps name as heroes or heroines of the Old Testament. Examples of faithfulness. And probably many of us would skip over Naomi. After all, what did Naomi do? She doesn't even get a book named after her, even though she may be the primary character. All she does is raise 2 sons, influence a daughter-in-law, give the daughter-in-law instructions to help fulfill God's law for levirate marriage, care for a grandson. And apparently she was enough of a caregiver that the story is actually told that Naomi now has a son. In some sense, in her loss of 2 sons, she now has a son. Well, let's look real quickly at the rest of the story of the book of Ruth, what we will call Act 4. The story is, not to repeat what we have already said, the story is that because Boaz is only the second in line of the kinsman redeemers, that they will meet at the town gate before the elders who were seated there. The elders were seated at the town gate to make decisions. The elders were seated at the town gate not to make decisions as much about daily life as about the application of the law. Sometimes as we think about the role of elders in Israel or the role of elders in the New Testament church, we think, well, they make every little decision that comes along. And I know that not to be the case. I know that because of the time I spent working with this congregation when more than once I heard the elders say, go ask the deacon in charge. We don't even know the answer to your question, but we know who does know the answer to your question. So the application was more that they sat at the town gate so that they could make decisions about the law. This was a matter of the law, the kinsman redeemer. And so Boaz appears at the town gate and the proposal is presented to the next in line, and that is that there's a piece of land belonged to Elimelech, and you are the one who has the first right of redemption. And no one except you has the right ahead of me. I'm the next in line. And the man who had the first right says, I'll redeem it. And then the rest of the story is told. Oh, by the way, you not only get the land, you also get the widow. You have to maintain the name of Elimelech. The son that you bear will technically be, so far as Old Testament law is concerned, the son of Elimelech will inherit the land of Elimelech in the name of his property. And the kinsman redeemer said that would endanger my own estate. Perhaps because his firstborn would then be an inheritor of Elimelech rather than of he himself. Very interesting part of what we've already studied together from Deuteronomy 25, Leviticus 25. And so another interesting part of the story is that when the first right of refusal, I'll call it, says no, there's an explanation. In verse 7, in the NIV, it's done parenthetically. Now, in earlier times, in this matter of redemption and transfer of property, when it became final, one party took off the sandal and gave it to the other. It's interesting because it seems to be inserted parenthetically and says something to us about the possible timing of the writing of the book. That the book was written with enough delay that not everyone would have known what the custom was back in the time of Leviticus, the time of some of the early settlers of the land, the time of Joshua. Again, our point being that we may be 200 or 300 years past the original conquest of the land. We did some of that kind of timing thing earlier. So Boaz says that since there has been a refusal of this one who has the first right, I will accept that responsibility. You are witnesses, the elders and those at the gate, verse 11. We're witnesses, and a blessing pronounced. In this particular case, that the offspring might be a blessing, famous in Bethlehem. May the Lord give you offspring to be like your ancestors. And Boaz marries Ruth. Verse 13, that's the story. She became his wife. She's able to conceive, gives birth to a son. And we continue to see, as we read carefully, this is a story about women. So verse 14 says, the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. So it's not only a kinsman redeemer for Ruth, we could say, with Elimelech, but also thinking about the descendants of Naomi. May he become famous throughout Israel. Renew your life. Your daughter-in-law who loves you has given you, your daughter-in-law is better to you than 7 sons and has given birth. Well, that phrase I have underlined. How can one daughter-in-law be better than 7 sons when you think about the history of Israel and the focus that was placed upon having sons who could be one who would inherit? And now the women say your daughter-in-law is better to you than 7 sons. We continue. Naomi takes the child, cares for him, probably a multi-generational family. And those women who are living there say, Naomi has a son. He's named Obed. He's David, the king's grandfather. He's the father of Jesse. So God is working in unique ways. He's working behind the scenes. God is always working in our lives. We may look at something and say, well, this person did it or that person did it. But the Israelites especially had a tendency to always answer with the same phrase, no, God did it. God did it. It's what God enables us to do. It's not what this church does in missions. It's not what I do in missions. It's what God enables us to do. God's the one who does it. Now, God uses us, but God is the one who does it. And so in the last few verses of Ruth, we have the genealogy of David set forth. beginning from Genesis chapter 38, when we come through Judah and the catastrophe with Tamar, but God uses what may look to be negative events, and we pick up the genealogy that we could have picked up in Genesis 38, and we follow through multiple generations. We have a list of 9 generations. So that would bring us down probably in our calculations not far enough, because we have 430 years that Israel spent in Egypt from the time of the giving of the promise to Abraham until the departure under Moses, which is a good opportunity for us to simply observe that, as is also the case in Matthew 1, that many of the genealogical records do not include every generation. Many times we have instead of the father of or the son of, we might more accurately read the descendant of, but there is a lineage that's being traced here. And if you do the numbers and the math, we move from Judah down to the time of David. And so that pretty well concludes then what we've tried to say about the book of Ruth. I told you last week that some of this would be a bit anticlimactic. This is kind of the rest of the story, but the story has almost already been told before we get to chapter 4 of the book of Ruth. We're going to spend the other half of our time together today introducing the book of Esther, because we have 10 chapters and we're only going to have 2 weeks left. That's not going to be a problem. Remember that I normally preach the book of Esther in 22 minutes, so to have 2 45-minute periods. And in fact, I will say more than I said. I'm speaking specifically to Jerry Lee here. Not long after I first moved to Fort Gibson, I was asked to speak at the Sunday evening baccalaureate service at the school back when we still had those, and we were still able to say something about God to those who were going to graduate. And my son timed me, Philip, who was fond of doing that in every situation, and I told the story of Esther and made the application for the graduates in 8 minutes. So don't worry about the fact that we may be getting behind. No, we'll figure out how to get it done. We'll get through this. But first of all, your comments about Ruth, or any questions or anything else you'd like to say that we perhaps have overlooked or not spent as much time on as you would like. Everyone with us? Everything okay? Okay, we have a comment. How blessed would you be to have a mother-in-law that you loved more than your physical family? She's leaving a family. We don't know the details of her family. We presume she had parents, grandparents, perhaps someone she could identify with, but she makes a choice. Now that's a pretty special mother-in-law, if I might say so. That's a pretty special mother-in-law. When you have someone who is as attractive or more attractive to cause you to leave, and they didn't call up every weekend or Zoom or use the technology that Jerry was talking about or even have a Pony Express or anything. It was more difficult given the distance. There's quite a separation that occurs there, and I think it does speak very, very highly, and not to re-preach Jerry's point, but speaks very highly to the character of Ruth, the love, the way that she incorporated Ruth into the family. Ruth is the one whose name means friendship, but Naomi is a great example of friendship as they together formed that bond. Good comment. Thank you, Jerry. What else? Well, we have another challenge. And I hope that maybe Jan says to me sometimes toward the end of the week, what are we going to talk about? And I say, well, this is what we're going to talk about. And she says, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that. Well, that kind of is a negative toward me if she's never heard me say this, because I should have said it. It should be said. But I want to begin to think about the story of Esther by simply giving you a timeline. And in order to do this, you need to turn over in your Bibles. Let's get to the book of Ezra. We're not going to spend a great deal of time, but we have in Ezra 1:1 a statement that says, in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, Cyrus gives permission to return home. That is around 539 BC. These are all before Christ dates. So we know where the book of Ezra begins. If we read on through the book, and we're not going to read about the 5,400 articles that were carried back, that's chapter 1. We're not going to read about the 42,360 plus 7,337 men servants and maid servants, 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, 6,720 donkeys. That's chapter 2. And you can read the summary. They came back and they began to work on rebuilding the altar in chapter 3. And they completed that work. It happened very soon after their return, let's say by 537. Most people say they didn't start back until 538. Now they began to work on rebuilding the temple, but it didn't get done. There was a delay because there was opposition. There was a great deal of opposition. In fact, to rebuilding the temple. This is the rebuilding of the temple, not of the wall. This is not the Nehemiah opposition. This is the opposition, and that opposition continued even later on. There's actually a kind of a parenthetical section that begins in 4:6, and then the story is picked back up. There was always opposition, but eventually a man named Darius came to the throne over in the Medo-Persian Empire, and you can see his dates, 522 to 486, and work began on the temple because he sent a letter, a decree, Ezra chapter 6, and the temple was dedicated. This, incidentally, is where Haggai and Zechariah belong in the Old Testament prophets. I was thankful that Dan gave me a little advance notice for this class, because then when I read about the lamplighter project, I thought, I know what I should do. I should begin, and I should be through the story of Esther by the time we get to the story of Esther. And so that's what I did. I began to read through the Old Testament. And I thought, well, while I'm doing that, I might as well put the minor prophets where they go and just read them in the right place historically rather than just as a unit. So I included the minor prophets and read through Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and the minor prophets. So I still have the major prophets and I still have the wisdom literature, but I've made a good beginning on the lamplighter project. I think perhaps I decided to use February for the New Testament. And so I'm working on the New Testament right now. I will tell you, and some of you already know this, that for the about first 15 years of my ministry, because of some heroes that had suggested weird ideas to me as I was in school, I read the New Testament every month. For about 15 years as I began ministry. It takes a little time, but it's not terribly time consuming. 260 chapters, 8 or 9 chapters a day. And if you just say, I'm going to do it, you do it. And it may be a little challenging the first time, but eventually you kind of think, I think I read this before. And it really did give me a great orientation. Back to our story. So the temple is completed because of Haggai and Zechariah in 516. And you can read about that in Ezra chapter 6. The completion, the dedication. They had a great big Passover like they hadn't had for numbers of years. And the work was completed on the house of God. Then chapter 7 and verse 1 says, after these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, Ezra came to Jerusalem. What your Bible doesn't tell you is that you just covered 60 years in the blank space between chapter 6 and chapter 7. If you can write in your Bible, it would not be bad to make a little note that says 60 years. We just covered 60 years from the time they they completed the temple, 516, and in 458, Ezra departed from Babylon. The rest of the book of Ezra is going to deal with what Ezra did when he came back to Jerusalem. He's going to bring more families with him. There's going to be letters from the king. There's going to be work done with regard to intermarriage. There's going to be a confession of sin. Ezra is well known for reading the law. And you can see that Nehemiah approaches the king and arrives in Jerusalem about 14 years after Ezra does. That's why in Nehemiah you can also read about Ezra the priest reading the law, because there's only 14 years after Ezra before Nehemiah comes on the scene. Now, if you look just real quickly at the book of Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and you look at the story of Nehemiah, you see a reference in 5:14 that says, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, I was appointed to be governor until the 32nd year. And so he went back, that is, Nehemiah went back to the land of King Artaxerxes to be the governor and to serve there, to approach that. And then if you look at Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 7, you kind of get the rest of the story when it tells us that I was not in Jerusalem all of this time, for in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, I had returned to the king, and sometime later I asked for permission to go back. So I'm not going to do all of the math for you. I ran out of room on the slide. All I want to tell you is that if someone asks you sometime about which is the last book of the Old Testament chronologically, the right answer is Nehemiah, not Malachi, because Malachi finished up before Nehemiah finished up. And so technically the last book of the Old Testament in English, well, it's Malachi if you're looking at our Bibles, but if you're looking chronologically, it's Nehemiah. And if you're looking at the Hebrew Bible, as you've already learned, it's 2 Chronicles, because we looked at that as we introduced the book of Ruth. Just interesting little details, but what's the point? The point is the one line of yellow. The point is that you go back to that 60-year gap that I pointed out between Nehemiah 6, Ezra 6, and Ezra 7, and that's where Esther belongs. That's where the story of Esther should be told. Obviously, that's not where it's inserted into the Old Testament. We have books, and in fact, in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah is one book among the writings. So we have the story of Esther. Xerxes comes to the throne. He succeeds his father, Darius. His son will be Artaxerxes, if you think about those references. So here is Xerxes and the years 486 to 465. So when we come to Esther chapter 1, and that's what we're ready to do. When we come to Esther chapter 1, the temple has been completed. The wall around Jerusalem has not been built. That will be done by Nehemiah. And so next week, what we're going to deal with is the book of Esther. This is an outline, very quickly. The feasts of Xerxes, so that Esther becomes the queen. Esther's first feast. You know the story, the banquet. Esther's second feast. You know the story, the banquet. And then the feasts of the Jews that are called the feasts of Purim. So 4 points, major points that are the feasts. And then within them, look at this, Mordecai uncovers a plot. Haman develops a plot. Then after the first feast, Haman's rage, Mordecai's honor. After the second feast, Haman is hanged and Mordecai is then promoted. So a very interesting organization of the book. One final point, the name of God does not appear. Some people have said, well, that shows it doesn't belong in the Bible. Other people say that was a literary device because if you can't read the story of Esther and see God, you've missed the point. God is at work in these events as well, and we will begin next week the story. There are 10 chapters. When we do the first 5 chapters, we will finish Esther's first feast. So this will be our outline. We'll get about halfway through it next week with Esther's first feast, and then we'll pick up really kind of what is the fun part of the story when Haman gets his due. But anyway, we'll try to see some other lessons along the way. Final word, who wants a final word? Someone who doesn't normally get a final word? Everyone happy? God bless, have a great week, and we'll talk next week beginning in Esther 1:1.